In this lecture, we're going to talk about PolyPaint inside of ZBrush. PolyPaint is one of the ways that we can apply color to our models inside of ZBrush. Now, polypainting is per vertex color. That means it's not based on UV coordinates. Now, if you don't know about UVs, I recommend watching the lecture on UV Master. UVs are essentially a two-dimensional coordinate system that allows you to wrap a 2D texture onto a 3D object. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I've got my creature painted on screen here. You see there's three subtools. There's the head, the eyes, and the teeth. Now the head is the currently selected subtool, and it has 5 subdivision levels. And if we step down to the lowest level and come down here to UV map, and if I click Morph UV, it flattens out. These are UV coordinates. These just allow us to wrap a two-dimensional texture onto a 3D object without it distorting. That's all UVs are. Now, right now, if I go to my texture map menu here, you can see I actually have a texture that's applied to this character. And this texture was created from polypainting. And at the end of this lecture, I'll show you how to do this. And you can also see more about this in the chapter on UV Master. But I'll turn the texture off, and now the color is still there. That is the PolyPaint color, and PolyPaint is found under the PolyPaint menu and Colorize. If I turn Colorize off, the color goes away. Now you'll notice the color is not very clear because it's per vertex. Each vertex gets an RGB value. So if I turn my resolution up on my Z tool, we get more resolution on the PolyPaint. So PolyPaint, like masking, is dependent upon the underlying geometry you're applying it to. So if I turn PolyPaint off now, it goes away. Turn it back on, it comes back. So how can we apply PolyPaint to our character? Well, we make sure that RGB is turned on up here at the top of the screen. The RGB channel makes sure that we are applying color when we're sculpting and painting. You see this brush right now, the standard brush, if I change to the dot stroke and turn my alpha off, RGB is turned on. Now the RGB channels are filled on this character with the color that you see right now. So if I select a different color like green, Z add and RGB, and then I draw, I'm sculpting and painting at the same time. If I turn off Z add, my brush will only add color. It's no longer painting. So if we want to start painting on our character, all we need to do is fill it with a base color. So right here, I've made this Z tool available to you in the downloads for this class so you can follow along. I've also adjusted the materials to make it look more like skin. So what I want to do is go to my material menu to start off with. I'll tear this off. And the current material that's assigned to the head is the basic material 2. If I change this to basic material, or let's say startup material, you see the settings change here. If I go to basic material 2, you see we have a wax modifier turned on here. This is what's giving its translucency. If I change to basic material, or excuse me, startup material, and then I turn on the material channel and go to color fill object, I can fill the object with that new material, and you see it changes. It's no longer translucent, and it has a different specular quality. So when I'm painting, I'd like to change that to the basic material standard settings, the basic material 2. That's my startup material. And then I'm going to adjust my specular settings because this is too shiny for skin. So I will go to my specular curve. I will expand this out, and that gives me a more diffuse specular shine. Then I'll turn the specular down. I don't want it down all the way. I just want it down a little bit. And I won't turn on the wax modifier yet. We will turn that on later in the painting process, but to start with, we won't. Now, if I change my material, nothing changes on the model. That's because I have filled the material channel with the material. If I want to clear the material channel entirely, I'll select the flat color material, go to material, not RGB, not mRGB, but just material, go to color fill object, and that clears the material channel, and that shows me just the raw color. Now if I change my materials, it changes on the model. Whatever material I have selected, I see previewed on the mesh. So we'll go back to Startup Material. Now I want to change my lighting. I don't want the lighting to be quite so dramatic, so I'll go to the light menu. I will have a second light here that's turned on. This light I have sitting behind the object. If I move it around, you see it's giving me a rim light. If I click it once, it will bring it in front of the object, and I will move this over to about 3 o'clock, and I will set it to, well, 0.9 is actually good. We'll set it to 1, and then I'll select my key light, and I'll bring my key light over to about 10 o'clock. And that's pretty good. Now I want my diffuse to be pretty bright so I can really see what I'm doing. I can turn this down and it becomes a little bit darker. Turn it up and my material or my colors become a little bit easier to see. Now what this does is it just evens everything out and makes it very easy for me to see what I'm painting. Now I have a different material set up on the eyes here to give them that sort of lifelike shine. If I want to sample that material and see what its settings are, what I'll do is I will click from my material swatch and drag over here and select. But remember, I have not filled this with a material channel. So if I change my material, it's going to change on the object. So what I want to do is go to my basic material, or my startup material, I mean. My startup material is my basic material too at its default settings. I simply clicked Save as Startup Material. So every time ZBrush starts, it starts with that material. We talk about that in the customization lecture. So with material turned on, I will go to Color, Fill Object. Now I'm going to click on the material swatch and drag, and anything that I mouse over, it will tell me what material is on there. So if I mouse over the eyes, I've now selected the eye material, and you can see that's toy plastic, and now it shows me the settings for that. I have the wax modifier turned on to give the eyes translucency. Let's solo them so we can see them easier. Make sure the eye subtool is selected. And these have PolyPaint on them as well, as you can see. It's just very, very simple PolyPaint to give me a little bit of a sense of life in those eyes. If I go to the Colorize menu and turn it off under PolyPaint, it's going to show me whatever color is selected. So if I go back to white, you can see there's a little bit of sculpting on there to give it an iris and a pupil. Turn Colorize back on. Now, the settings that I have on this, I'm going to add a couple subdivision levels so we get a nicer edge on our highlights there. Toy plastic, I have the strength turned up to 23 on the wax modifier. Now, when you use the wax modifier, you need to make sure that you go to the render menu. Under render properties, make sure wax preview is turned on. If that's not on, you won't see the wax preview. You can see the difference as I turn that on and off. If I turn this up higher, it gives me more translucency in the eye. I have the specular turned all the way up, and the specular curve is crunched all the way over here to the side to give me a nice sharp specular highlight. Down here, I have gel shading set to 1. Gel shading gives us kind of a translucent quality to the eye. Gel shading 1 and 2 are slightly different. Gel shading 0 is essentially turned off. Now, I could go further on this if I wanted to. I quite like this natural kind of hot spot, like a studio lighting. But if I go to my texture swatch here and then select a color texture, for example, this what's called a mountain cliche or a desert cliche. It's from marker rendering in industrial design. Often this sort of landscape abstract is used to represent reflection. So if I have this texture turned on and then come up here to reflectivity and turn that up, I'll start to see that reflection on that eye surface. So you might elect to use something like that. I chose not to for this particular eye just because it didn't need something quite so complex. However, we do talk elsewhere in these lectures about creating transparent glass. That's in our materials and rendering chapter, where we will use this extensively to create a glass shader, which is a corneal bulge over an eye, because the eye has a lens that pokes out. This eye doesn't have that. It's simplified for sculpting, but we do have a lecture where we talk about creating a realistic eye with multiple parts, and we'll use that there. So I'll turn that texture off. So that's how I created this more realistic looking eye, just to give me a little something to engage with as I'm painting. So let's click on the swatch, drag over to the body, and now we're back to our basic material 2, which has been saved as a startup material. So to paint, what we want to do now is zoom out of our model a little bit, Alt-click on the head itself. Now, if my brush is set to Z-Add and RGB is turned off, then I am simply sculpting. As you can see, I'm moving shapes around here. I can adjust that eyelid. He was looking a little droopy-eyed there. Move things around. If I go to my standard brush, go to the drag rectangle stroke, or we'll go to the dot stroke and select something like Alpha 60, which is a nice wrinkle alpha here. I'll turn that up and turn my Z intensity down. Hold down the Alt key. I'm sculpting as you would expect. Let me make sure that material is turned on. Turn on Z Add. Make sure that if you go to start changing your brush settings, that you update them so you are sculpting and not just putting down materials. So I can sculpt wrinkles along the neck here. I can sculpt wrinkles coming out of the face center here, sort of crosshatch wrinkles on the nasolabial folds here. Radiate wrinkles down into the mouth area. Press the Shift key. Now, make sure your default settings on the smooth brush are going to have RGB turned on. Turn that off so it doesn't actually blend your color. I'm going to add another subdivision level to the head here, and that's going to bring it up to 6 million polygons and make it a little bit easier to capture details. So here, as we start sculpting detail, if I press the Shift key, I can smooth that detail. If RGB is turned on, it will smooth the underlying PolyPaint, as you can see there. So be aware of that if you sculpt on something that has polypainting applied to it, that your smooth brush may very well counteract your polypainting. I'll turn off my X symmetry and just do a little bit of cross-hatching here, and then smooth with RGB turned off. So that's sculpting. We have our Z-Add turned on our brush. So that means that as we're painting on the surface, we are actually getting a sculptural effect. But if we turn off Z-Add and turn on RGB, now we are just adding color. So let's go ahead and fill the object with a base color. I'm going to click on my color swatch here, drag over, and just grab a base tone off the canvas itself. This is a nice sort of pale pasty base tone to use for this light skin tone. Make sure RGB is turned on, RGB intensity is at 100%, and I will go to color, fill object, and that fills the object with that base tone. I'm going to close this left-hand dock because we don't need the material settings right now. Now I want to start adding in a base color, or base layers of painting, I should say. So I will use the standard brush. I'm going to change my stroke to the spray stroke. Under the spray stroke settings here, there is a color slider that defaults to 0.5. Turn that down to 0. The reason we do that is that will modulate the color selection when you're painting and give you variations, and I don't want that. I only want to put down my selected color. Now I'm going to change my alpha. I'm going to turn my alpha off to start with, and I'm going to select the color red, just like that. Now, there is a tool called Z-Color. It's under the Z plugin menu, Z-Color right here. Now, we talk about Z-Color in another lecture in depth. This is a more advanced color picker for ZBrush that allows you to store swatches and color values and color harmonies. So make sure you take a look at this video as well, because we'll go into Z-Color, and as you get more advanced in your painting, it's much better, I think, than just using this color picker. However, this is an introduction to PolyPaint, so we're going to simplify things by using this. So we have our color selection, our standard brush with the spray stroke. Z-Add is turned off, material is turned off, we are only painting RGB. So if I turn on X symmetry and I start painting, we get this broken up sort of dot pattern, which is okay, but it's not really the best for painting skin. We want skin to be painted with a broken up sort of chaotic pattern. So I'm going to further customize this brush by going to the alphas and selecting alpha 7, which are just these little dots. And this sort of approximates an airbrush where you've got your settings on the airbrush set so it spatters out little dots of paint when you're painting. So I'm going to use this to paint just by clicking on the surface and dragging. And that spits out these little dots of color. Now, if I hold down the Alt key while I'm painting, I'm going to put down my alternate color, which you see right now is that black. So what I will do is I will switch color. Now the switch color key for ZBrush is V. That switches my selected color. If you watch right here, you see them switching. And I'm going to go to my secondary color and select the base tone. Now if I press V again, so I'm painting red, I can put red down, press V, and I can paint the base tone back. So this is a nice way to sort of erase out what I'm doing. So the way I like to approach painting creature skins, I'll show you now. I start by creating what I call a temperature map. A temperature map is a base painting, an underpainting, where I paint the warm areas of the face and the cool areas of the face. And this is a very overstated, very bold map. The first thing that people usually do as a mistake when they're trying to do this is they make this too subtle. You can't make this too subtle because we're going to paint several layers on top of it, which will push it down into the subsequent layers of paint. So keep your RGB intensity high, standard brush, spray stroke, dot alpha, and then make your primary color red. And we're going to go in here and we're going to paint red into the areas of the face that tend to be warmer. Things like the nose and the cheeks. The ears tend to be warmer. Now we will put red all over everything, but I want to cluster it strongest in the areas that I want to be warmer in my final painting. And this may be counterintuitive, it may be strange to you, but I encourage you to follow along here and trust me, or you can even watch the video through to the end and see how this all comes together. The important thing to know is this is an underpainting. This needs to be bold so it will be visible as we put more color on top of it. All painting styles, for the most part, other than maybe alla prima, the kind of impressionist style of painting, uses an underpaint or an underpainting and sort of glazing of color on top. So I'm going to paint red all through here. And I'm just going to make sure that it's not quite so strong in the mouth area here. Now, if I don't want to see my subtools, I can turn off or turn on solo, and I don't have to see the subtools, and I'll paint warmer tones, reds down here into the mouth, around the teeth, in the nose and the eyes. These are areas where the blood vessels are most close to the skin, and the temperature variations are going to be more pronounced the lighter the skin tone is, but you can still modulate your color temperature across any skin tone. That includes all human skin tones, and I will do it in alien skin tones, things like green skins and purple skins, because it just makes things feel more realistic. We're not going to focus too much on the back of the head. We're going to focus in on the face for the purposes of this demonstration, but I wanted to put a little color back there. So I'm just putting reds all through. And again, like I said, clustering them into the areas where the face is going to be the warmest. Hold down the Alt key and I can paint the base color back in a little bit if I want to sort of push back in areas that might have gone too warm. There we go. Now the next color I'm going to select is a cool blue. I would stay away from this end of the blue spectrum. That's getting towards warm, so that's a warm blue, something like ultramarine blue. I'm going to move it over here towards a cooler blue because we want to have a nice color contrast in terms of temperature. We're going to put blue down here in the lower part of the face, and this is going to be even more pronounced if someone has facial hair or stubble, because the hair follicles there with the hair down inside them, because skin is translucent, it's going to cool off that area. It's not going to refract back as much of sort of the blood vessels and the warmth in that area. So I'm going to paint cooler tones into the lower part of the face. I'll also paint cool tones into the recessed areas. Now we're starting to get what's called simultaneous contrast or optical mixing, where we have one color next to another color, we tend to perceive a tertiary color. So in this case, where the reds get close to the blues, we start to see a violet, especially into the eye sockets. I want to press that. I'm also putting cool colors into the recessed areas because in color theory, we know that cool colors tend to recede from us and warm colors look like they're advancing towards us. So by painting a cooler tone or cooler hue down into recessed areas, we can accentuate that depth later on in our painting as we put more layers on. So I'm just going to put some cool tones in here. And again, this is overstated. This can be really bold. It's much, much easier to make this work if you overdo this base layer than it is if you underdo it. Because if you overdo it, all you have to do is put more layers down on top to make it sink into the surface. If you underdo it, it'll become illegible too soon and it won't work. So I can't stress enough, and I say this in my Gnomon online classes, that you cannot overdo this particular layer. So be bold. Don't be afraid to really push it. Now, look here where we've got the base tone and the blue meeting. We're starting to get a little bit of green. That's because there's a lot of yellow in that base color. If we go around to the back of the head, there's quite a bit of yellow here. It's pretty much a yellow ochre. So where the yellow meets the blue, if you take yellow and blue and mix those two primaries together, you get the secondary color green. That's optical mixing. We didn't put green down on our canvas, but we're seeing green because of optical mixing. And by working that way, we end up getting a more lively and interesting looking surface. Let's bring a little bit more red through there, and that starts to go orange. Now I'm going to select yellow, so I'll pick yellow here, and I'm not going to use a really, really strong yellow. I'm going to desaturate it a little bit, like that. Yellow I tend to use in areas that the skin is sort of thinnest, where the bone's closest to the surface, and I put yellow, like red, pretty much everywhere, but I really do cluster it into areas where the bone is really close to the skin. We'll bring it down through here. And I'm just going to paint it over everything, and it will help to start to tie things together. You'll start to get oranges, and where it crosses over the blues, you'll start to get greenish tones. The same technique works for any type of alien skin. You can just change the colors that you put, or the order of the colors you put down. I would still start like this for like a green skin. Once we get to the next layers, I would just start painting greens down. If I was painting a different human skin tone, I would use the same basic colors. I would change the order in which I put them down, and I would change the intensity. So if I was painting a darker skin, I would maybe start with some variation of a yellow ochre and then work my way towards the darker hues, modulating my temperature with the reds and the blues. And later on, we're going to pick a raw umber, which is a brownish color. So in the darkest skin tones, I would be using variations of raw umber sooner than I would in a lighter skin tone. I chose this particular skin tone because it was easier to show how all of these different pieces fit together, because you can get away with kind of big, broad strokes. It's easier to learn on this sort of monster skin that looks like something that's been living in a cave and doesn't get any sunshine and is very pale and kind of splotchy skin. It's easier to learn painting like this than if we tried to do a realistic painting of skin. But the same, absolutely the same techniques would apply. You would just be a little bit more reserved. You would tighten up your patterning, things like that. So I'm going to warm up those ears again. Now you can paint into layers, and in my layers lecture, we do talk about that. I'll go up to the tool menu here and show you layers. We have an entire lecture where we talk about layers in ZBrush. You can sculpt in layers and also paint in layers. Now, if I'm painting in a program like Mari, I tend to use layers. But I don't use layers when I paint in ZBrush as a general rule. That could come from the fact that I learned to paint with an airbrush. Painting as a makeup effects artist, I used to paint prosthetics and props and things with an airbrush, and there's no undo button there, and there's no layering there. I would just basically paint and fix anything that went wrong as I went along by adjusting my colors. And I think that's actually a valuable lesson to learn. I would encourage you, as you're exploring painting in ZBrush with PolyPaint, don't focus too much on layering. as you're painting. Just play around and learn how to paint through your mistakes, because that's really a valuable thing to understand. And I think it gives you a lot of confidence. Now, in a production environment where I need to have flexibility, because someone invariably will come along and say, oh, we need to change this or that, you simply have to use layers. But I tend to use PolyPaint and ZBrush as a concept painting tool. And also, there is a new tool as of the last version of ZBrush under PolyPaint called Adjust Colors. Now, we talk about this in other lectures as well, but we'll talk about it here. This will give you a lot more flexibility when it comes to changing your PolyPaint after you've put it down. I want to warm up this ridge of horns here. I think that this it's reasonable to expect that these could be warmer. And I'll turn my solo off so we get our stuff there again. So there we go. I will often call this the clown vomit pass. It should look like a clown got sick on cotton candy and just threw up all over your model. It should look ridiculous. If it doesn't look ridiculous at this stage, push it further. Because I cannot stress enough, this is an underpainting. This has to be bold because it will be visible through your later layers of painting. So I'm going to come down here with the red. I'm going to press the V key to switch my color, and I'm just going to put a little bit of red through here in the chest. I just want to warm up some of these areas a little bit more. And I'm being very gestural. I'm being very quick and bold. Don't be afraid to make big brush strokes. Now, at this stage, if I wanted to, I could click and drag and sample color directly from the canvas. It gives me a variation. It gives me a hue that's based on the sample. If I want the actual color again, I would just go back to my color wheel here and select it. I'm going to bring yellow back in a little bit through here. And there we go. So that's our underpainting. Now, the next layer we're going to do is called a mottling pass. That's spelled M-O-T-T-L-I-N-G. Mottling are squiggly lines. I'm going to stay with the standard brush, but I'm going to change my stroke to drag rectangle, and I'm going to change my alpha to the vein alpha, which is alpha, let's find it here, alpha 22. It's the squiggly lines. And I'm going to select white as my color. Now, for the first time, I'm going to change my RGB intensity. I will turn it down. Now, what are we going to do here? Well, first off, I'm going to turn off my X symmetry when I get to the center line, because if I don't, I'll get things like this, which look like sort of Rorschach ink blot tests, and they're very, very striking. You'll notice these as a viewer, and it's hard to get rid of them. So turn off your X symmetry, and I'm going to make sure that I'm at a high enough subdivision level to give me really good resolution on these squiggles. So I'm stepping up now. We're at 6 million polygons. I'll zoom in. I'm going to create a squiggle pass. And I'll turn my RGB intensity down a little bit more. There we go. Now what this is, it's just a whole bunch of little squiggly lines. Sometimes people call this a figure 8 pass or a noodling pass. The point of this is white will neutralize and desaturate any color that you mix with it. So what happens here, it cools it off and desaturates it. So I'm going to turn my X symmetry back on as I get further away from the center line. So everything that's in between these little squiggles is going to maintain its saturation. It's going to maintain its color temperature. It's going to maintain the overall look. Everything underneath the white is going to become muted. Now what that will do is it will help give us the effect of a fibrousness or translucency to this skin when we put the next layer of color on top of it. So this is sort of like an interference pattern. It's a way of breaking up this big, bold color pass into something that will be more subtle once we paint the base tone back on, because that's the next step after this. We're going to take our original base color and we're going to paint it on top of everything, and that will push all these squiggles and all these dots deeper into the skin. Now, when I'm painting this for work or for my own projects, I tend to do this pass manually. I'll take a standard brush and a small alpha, and I will manually draw those squiggles out. Now, that is time consuming, and it always does depend on what my time frame is, how much time I have to finish something. But in the face, I'll often do this manually just because it gives me more control. For this demonstration, I'm using the alpha because it's, I think, easier the first time you do this to use an alpha for it, because you can get through this stage faster and see why you're doing it. One big thing with learning is you need to know why you're doing a thing. and at least for me. And I teach based on how I learn. And I had a real hard time with things like painting when I was in art school because I wanted to know how to paint. And I found it very hard to find a professor who would tell me why you picked certain colors, why you laid out your palette certain ways. Surprisingly, it's very hard at some schools to find teachers who can tell you that. And when I finally found somebody who told me the why, I could understand it. The same is true for algebra. I never understood algebra until I found a teacher who was an art collector. And they explained algebra to me using paintings and using art, which may sound strange, but it worked. So the reason I say that is because I use this alpha for the demonstration because I want you to be able to get through this pass relatively quickly and see why you're doing it. So if we zoom out a bit now, you can see it's breaking everything up. It's an interference pattern. And we want to make sure that our alpha crisscrosses and is as random as possible. And when we paint our base color back on top of this, everything you see will start to sink down into the skin and you'll immediately start to get the look of translucency, which is what we're going for. We want everything to feel a little bit translucent, a little bit broken up. And that's where it really starts to come together. And this is a very fast way of painting. If I do this without talking about it and demonstrating it, I can paint a creature's skin in about an hour, maybe less. Especially for a concept. If I'm trying to get a good concept out, I can start something like this with polypainting, and then I could render my images out, composite them in Photoshop, and then carry on my painting. Now I'm getting close to the center line, so I will turn off my X symmetry. That's so important. In my Gnomon online classes, when I teach this class, the homework the next week, consistently, there's always a couple people that forget to turn off their X symmetry. And it's just so difficult to get rid of that symmetrical look in the underpainting. Even once you start laying down colors on top of it, it persists. So be really careful at the center line to break that symmetry. So that's the funny thing about starting in traditional media and then moving into digital sculpting and painting. In traditional sculpture, and it's very hard to get something symmetrical. There is a certain degree of symmetry that you want to have in your sculptures in most cases. But in ZBrush, we need to take special care to make sure we introduce asymmetry. Otherwise, something feels quite unnatural because nothing is ever perfectly symmetrical. You can play on that as a designer. You can make something symmetrical, and it gives it a very nice, uncanny quality. If I'm not mistaken, I think Neville Page played with the uncanniness of symmetry in Prometheus with the engineers. I was looking at those, and I may be wrong. I never asked Neville about it, but there is an uncanniness to those faces, intentionally so, obviously, because they're aliens, which I think comes from a certain degree of symmetry, which is playing on that fact that as humans, we are not accustomed to seeing symmetry in anything other than flowers or seashells or things that are not human or humanoid faces. So be aware of that. It can be a problem or it can be a tool that you use. So as we get further from the face, we can expand out the squiggle pass. This doesn't have to be so tight. And I think it can benefit by being broader when you get away from the areas of interest. Now you can use your own alphas for this too. I actually have a selection of custom alphas I sometimes use for mottling. And I mottle on everything. Everything you paint, or everything I paint, has mottling in there. And if I'm painting something for production, like I'm painting, let's say, for example, a digital double of an actor, and that happens, there's a lot of call for that, and usually you're using projections for something like that, meaning you are projecting photo reference. We project photo reference in ZBrush in another chapter where we talk about Spotlight. We're able to take photo reference and project it onto our models in here. The reason I bring that up is even when you're projecting high quality photo reference, it's really good to know how to paint skin because there's invariably going to be areas that don't work. You never get a good photograph of the ear because the ear will have shadows in it. And you really don't want to have shadows in your texture map. In film production and VFX textures, you want to avoid shadows in your textures because the shadows will be created by the lighting and shading. And if you have shadows in your textures, it can look very weird and create strangeness in the renders. So you want to avoid that. So you're typically going to have to go in and hand paint certain areas. I think it's really nice to understand how to paint skin because you can supplement your other work that way, and you're much more effective as a texture painter and as an artist if you're not always relying on projecting reference. It's especially true with creatures. There's certain types of skin patterning you might want to create that just doesn't exist. Maybe you want to paint something based on aquatic textures, aquatic skin markings, or amphibious skin markings, like in poisonous frogs and whatnot. So if you're able to paint these things in manually, so to speak, you're going to be much more, you're going to have a lot more freedom in your work. I'm just going to make larger patterning down here because this is not an area of interest. I don't want it to be lazy and too big, but I'm happy for it not to be too tight. And I'm varying my pressure on my Cintiq right now, which should vary my opacity just a little bit. I get a lot of questions about what type of tools to use with ZBrush, if you can use ZBrush with a mouse. I've known a couple absolutely exceptional sculptors who used a mouse with ZBrush, but I wouldn't recommend it. You don't have to have a Cintiq. You don't even have to have a Wacom. Some type of tablet, and there's various types of tablets available on the market, will make your life a lot easier. Now, there are some tools that I do use with a mouse. I always use a mouse for things like Z-spheres, and I always use a mouse for Z-modeler. But for sculpting and painting, I'm always using a tablet. So you can get, a pretty inexpensive Wacom or another brand, or you can go all out and get a Cintiq. I used to not like the Cintiq because I had the first generation version of it, like the very first Cintiq. I didn't like how it felt to sculpt with, but that was the first iteration. And then I was using an Intuos 4 for many, many, many years. I used an Intuos 4 for a long time because it lasted forever. And then recently I got a Cintiq 16 Pro, and I just love it. It's great, especially when I'm painting in Photoshop. If I'm, just doing direct digital painting or illustration, it makes life so much easier. And in ZBrush, it's just fantastic. So it's a really, really, really great tool. So there we go, crisscrossing this, making sure that we've got good coverage over everything. There we go. And I want to make sure I get coverage here at the tip of the nose. Everything should have squiggles. Later on, we will mottle again, but we won't use white. We'll mottle with purples and reds. This is a great way to break up skin textures. When I was on the Hobbit series, I was painting skins for orcs. And to save time, we were using actual human skins and then hue shifting them and then mottling on top of them. We were using various mottles of reds and purples and whatnot to give the orcs this real monstrous, livid kind of skin texture. I'm going to turn the subtools back on so he's a little more entertaining to look at. He looks happier now. He's starting to get skin again. There we go. And I just want to break that up. Break some of that up. I'm going to step back and just make sure that I don't have any sort of real obvious empty spots here. We'll bring a little bit more in here, and there we go. So there's our mottling pass. I'm going to quick save with the 9 hotkey, and then we're going to do our next pass. And our next pass is back to the spray stroke. By the way, don't be misled by color spray. Don't use that stroke. The color spray stroke will change your color selection as you're painting, and you don't want that. You want to know the colors you put down are the colors you've selected. So spray stroke, make sure color is turned down to 0, and then we're going to go back to those little dots, alpha 7. Now I'm going to select my base color again and turn my RGB intensity down. Now we can turn X symmetry back on because you're not going to recognize symmetry with dots. Now I'm going to start painting the base color back on top, and I've turned my RGB intensity down because I want to build this up stroke by stroke. I could maybe turn it up a little bit more. Let's turn it up to 44. I don't want to go quite to 50 yet. Now what I should see here is as I keep putting these strokes down, you start to see that color sinking down into the surface. We want to see all this start to sink into the skin. Now, don't do this. Don't turn your RGB intensity all the way up and obliterate it. We don't want that. Definitely not. We want to gently push it back. So it'll take multiple passes. I just want to keep spraying my strokes down. And I could step down a subdivision level. Just one. Don't go down too low because then you're going to lose resolution in your texture. But since we're just misting color, basically, we're just lightly pushing everything back into the skin, we don't need that super high frequency that we did for the mottling pass because we wanted real sharp edges, real nice fidelity in our veining there, our squiggles. So here you can see what's happening. You see that starts to sink into the skin. Now, it's okay if you still see squiggles, because this is still not the final pass of color. We've got more that goes on top of this. The idea behind this is to push those subsequent layers deeper into the skin. That's all. Don't obliterate it. It's going to start to go a little chalky. You're going to start to say, oh, no, I'm messing up because I'm losing the colors. No, you should. This is going to make those temperature variations much more subtle. Now, I might not go quite as heavy in areas that I want to keep a little bit more bold, like around the mouth, inside the nostrils, the tip of the nose. But as I push back these areas, you see it becomes more subtle. We still have the green cast here, the blue cast here, purple. It's still there. We want this to make things more subtle, so it's okay for things to start to get a little bit more muted. Don't panic over that. That's the next stage where people start to sort of mess up if they try this. So hopefully by pointing those out, I can save you the trouble of running into that issue before you do. But if you do run into it and backtrack, that's fine. That's how we learn. One thing that I can say about painting as well as sculpting, anything in ZBrush, if something's not working, if you're looking at something and it just doesn't seem right, try and avoid just picking colors and putting them down, or try and avoid just moving things around with your brush at random. Take a moment, step back and ask yourself, well, what is it that's not working? And why is it not working? And then try and make a decision based on that. You can't always do that. There's many times that I will find myself sort of experimenting with a brush, saying, well, if I move this and move this, gosh, this doesn't appeal to me. What's wrong? But I do try to make sort of educated decisions, make a proper decision and go with it, rather than just sort of blindly changing things in the hope that something works. So there we go. There's our first pass of painting the base tones back on top. Now we're going to want to do our temperatures again. We want to warm areas up again, and we want to sort of tighten things up. So let's take a look at that now. So I'm going to go back to red, primary red, but now I'm not going to use the full RGB intensity. Because things have started to become more muted, I want to come back in here and start to work into my color temperature again. Also, at this stage, we can turn on our translucency. So I will go to my material menu. I will take the wax modifier strength and turn this up. And now immediately we start to get some translucency in the skin. If you don't see that effect, go to your material or go to your render menu and make sure wax preview is turned on. Now I will go back in here and start to warm up areas. So we're going to paint the reds back through the nose and the cheeks using a smaller, tighter brush stroke now. And remember, we have our RGB intensity turned down a little bit. We don't want this to be so overstated as it was in the beginning. Now we are trying to be a little bit more subtle. And again, these are dots, so I don't have to worry about symmetry quite so much. Let's bring it down into the mouth area here. I like to make the mouth kind of look irritated and sort of red and maybe just like nasty. So I'll put a little bit more red through there for this monster. Let's warm up the earlobes, the outer cartilage of the ear. That's called the helix. I am going to switch color, and now I can click from the swatch and grab based on the actual skin that I've painted. So I can grab, let's say, this tone here, and I will turn my RGB intensity up a little bit and just spray through here. Press the V key, switch to red, spray a tiny little bit of red through there. We don't want that to be too warm because we want to keep that lower portion of the face a little bit cooler. Down here through. By the way, remember what I said about the cool hues? You can see how the blue is still peeking through the underpainting there. So we're getting a nice sort of cooler look down inside those recesses. I'm going to switch color back to a skin tone, the base skin tone. I am going to push some of that chest back a little bit. The squiggles are a little too strong down there, so I'm going to push those back, switch to the red, bring some red through here, and I'm being very bold. I'm painting with my whole arm, basically. I'm being very aggressive there. Maybe we'll go back to a bit of blue, bring some blue through here. There we go. Now the next step is my favorite. This is where we bring in raw umber. So if I go to kind of an orange hue here and then turn my value down, I get a color like this. This is actually it's a burnt umber. This is a warm brown. If I were to move it over here, that's a bit cooler. That's more of a raw umber. So you can remember raw umber is cool, whereas burnt is hot, so it's warm. So I'm going to grab a warmer brown, and I might actually later go to a cooler one because the overall skin tone, let's do a cooler one. I'm going to move it over towards yellow, and then that's going to cool that off because I made that choice because the skin tone is quite warm, so I want to contrast with a cooler freckling spray stroke, but this time I'm going to select a little dot alpha, something like alpha 47. And the freckling here is always where I think it really starts to come together. I'm just going to start to spray these freckles down on the surface. And I'm just gesturally sort of swiping my brush around. Let's turn the draw size down so we get smaller freckles, and we can start to get these sort of age spots or these little bits of pigmentation in the skin. I'm going to go to my material settings. I'm going to turn the wax strength down just a little bit. And I'm going to turn my diffuse down a little bit so it's not quite so bright. And I'm also going to go to my material settings again. And I think I'm going to take my specular down just a little bit more because I'm getting a lot of specular on there. And it's making it a little bit harder to see. There we go. Come out here on the shoulders. It's really going to help this area here. I'm just going to spatter these all through here. And it's going to start to break up that surface really nicely. I'm just doing random kind of figure 8 strokes. As you can see, if you follow my brush crosshair, I'm being very, very bold with this. Now, these might create some symmetry patterns there, so I will turn off X symmetry and sort of crisscross over that center line to kind of mask some of that from view. Let's go back to our materials. I'm going to tear the material menu off, and I will turn my diffuse back up a little bit and give my wax a little bit more strength. Turn my X symmetry back on when I get away from the center line of the head, and we can start to spray those freckles through the lower portion of the face here. Turn my draw size down, or alternately you can select, this is alpha 47. I could go to a very, very tiny alpha, like alpha 40. And this you need to bring your draw size up to really see them. You can get a nice, very, very fine patterning with this. I'm going to turn the X symmetry off and just bring these through here. Turn up my RGB intensity a little bit. And this is my favorite part of the painting, is when we start putting these down, because it just really then is when it starts to come together for me. And so from this stage, I will continue to do a lot of freckling with browns and whites and reds, just to tighten everything up and make it a little bit more interesting. Let's bring these freckles out into the temples here. I'm going to go back to alpha 47, turn my draw size down. There we go. So you still see those layers of underpainting. They're all in there, but they're working together in concert now to create an overall skin texture. I'm going to switch color, and I'm actually going to go back to something close to white, but not necessarily white. And I'm going to do some freckling with white through here. Very, very lightly, just breaking up areas that maybe went too dark or have too much of a temperature shift to them. I can cool off areas with white. There we go. Now I'm going to go back to red, and let's do something a little bit darker. And we'll take this and we'll spray this into the eye area. And we'll let this sort of venture out, maybe around the nostrils a little bit, into the mouth here, around those teeth. There we go. And I'll go back to our base color. Just click and drag and grab something like the base color and go back to our dots. And at this stage, the painting is all about basically revisiting the same sort of techniques of spattering, mottling, and then pushing things back as necessary. So if I want to push back some of that freckling, I'm just spraying the base color back on top at a low RGB intensity so they don't obliterate. You don't get rid of anything. You just let that peek through subsequent layers of paint. So now I'm going to go back to my drag rectangle stroke, the vein alpha, that was alpha 22, and now let's grab a purple. Let's get a real deep, dark purple, even darker than that. Let's really push it. There we go, and then I'll turn my RGB intensity down, and then we'll just do some sort of mottling coming out of the mouth here, real subtle. Just put some veining through here. Again, be careful with your X symmetry in this area. So let's put this veining into the mouth here. Maybe let some of these come up out of the mouth area like this. Usually it's nice to have these sort of broken blood vessels in the nostrils, so we'll put them here. And I'll turn my X symmetry back on and turn RGB up and bring some of these veins into the eyes, making sure to crisscross them. We definitely want to crisscross them, and that's a little strong. I'll turn my RGB intensity down. There we go. Now, we can also mask to assist in our painting. A great mask to use is Mask by Cavity. So if we go to the masking menu, I'm going to close all these submenus here, and we go to masking, there is Mask by Cavity. Now, Mask by Cavity has an intensity control here, and it also has a cavity profile. If I open cavity profile and then just make this a straight up and down line, turn intensity up, and then click Mask by Cavity, it masks into all the recess areas. So if I control-click on the background, I can now unmask everything that's pushing in and leaving all the high points masked. So I'll turn off View Mask. The mask is still there. It's just not visible because I've hidden it. Now I can go to the spray stroke and the dot alpha, maybe turn up my RGB intensity, and then I can spray that darker purple down into those recesses inside the mouth there. Let's turn the RGB intensity up even higher so you can really see that effect. Now, if I overdo it, it's going to become quite sort of crispy, but look in these wrinkles here. In these wrinkles, if I turn down my RGB intensity and then paint across the upper lip, we're painting into those wrinkles. Down here, we're painting into these wrinkles, and it's helping us sort of accentuate our details. Now, I would be really careful painting into wrinkles. I wouldn't overdo it because it could start to read like you're painting in shadow. And like I said, in most cases, you don't want to paint shadows into your color maps. You don't want to paint shadows into your textures. You want those to be part of your lighting. Let's bring some reds into that. Now, if I turn view mask back on, I can blur mask like this, and then turn view mask off. So you see that what we get there. If I control click on the background, I can invert that. So that softened the edge of that mask, so I can get a nice little blend off of that just by painting over that same area again. And let's do that around the eyes here. We can get a nice sort of red. We'll turn our solo off so we can see the subtools again. There we go. Or we can go into the ears and we can paint into the ear recesses. Clear the mask. And there we go. So I think the last thing that I will do is go back to my little dot, maybe alpha 47, select the base color, something close to the base color. Turn my RGB intensity up, and I'm just going to spray a little bit of freckling of the base color around the edges of this just to break it up. So it's not quite so theatrical makeup. And I say that I'm done, but then I see something else that I want to change. I want to warm up the nose again, the wings, the nostrils there, tip of the nose, and there we go. So let's go to our light menu again. So we've got this real broad lighting that's not doing us any favors. It's good for painting, but not good for seeing our character. So I will put that light behind the model again, like so. Just by clicking on the orange dot, that puts it behind the model, gives us a rim light. I will go to my key light, and I will set this to 1. And I'll take that key light and bring it up here to about 11 o'clock this time. Maybe I'll set it to 1.2, just get it a little bit brighter. There we go. So we're getting a lot more dramatic lighting now. Make sure my perspective is turned on. Go to our material settings. We are on the skin materials, so we can adjust our translucency on that. And if I go to my light menu here, something that's neat and often overlooked is you can change your distance here, and that can actually give you a bit of a more dramatic look. That just changes the global distance of the light to the object. So let's position him on screen. And we'll go to Render, go to BPR Shadow, and I'll turn the shadow angle up, and I'll turn my rays up to maybe 24 or so. Don't worry, we have a whole chapter on rendering, so we'll talk about these settings in much more depth, but I just want to show you what it looks like once we render it. So we've got our lighting set up, and I think I'm going to go to my rim light, which is the second light here, and I'm going to turn the intensity up so it's a little bit stronger rim light. We can do something like this and then grab that and pull it even further over to the edge so we get a thinner rim light. And I can change the color. Maybe I want a cooler light there because it's such a warm base color on the character. So we'll do something like this. And then we'll render. And that will use the BPR or Best Preview Render to render our character with light and shadow and give us a nice looking image. There we go. So you see we get some nice shadows in there, and we get a good looking skin. So that's painting creature skins from scratch. So that's the entire process that I use to paint a creature skin, and I would use this for any skin type, for any type of alien or monster. I would use this for green skins, purple skins, light skins, dark skins, and if I was painting human skin tones, and I was not doing totally image projection, if I needed to paint a human skin from scratch, I would do the same. I would use the same colors. I would just change the order in which I put them down and their proportions. But doing hand painting a human skin from scratch is a bit beyond the time limits that we have to illustrate here, but this will get you started on poly painting. Now, I said that I would show you how to turn this into a texture map. Now, you're going to have UVs to make a texture map, and like I said, if you have not yet seen the UV master video, be sure to watch that if you don't know how to create UVs. So my character is at its highest subdivision level, level 6, and that's really important because if you don't have your mesh at its highest subdiv level, you won't get your full resolution of your color map. Then I will go down to texture map. In Texture Map, I will open the Create submenu and click New from PolyPaint, and that generates a new texture right there based on my poly painting. Now, I can't get this out of ZBrush from this menu, what I need to do is click the Clone Texture button. That clones the texture out of this texture swatch and into the main texture swatch. This is important. Anything in this texture swatch will not save with your Z tool. The reason ZBrush puts it in this one is because this is associated with the Z tool. So if I click Save As, and I save this as PolyPaint Demo, let me move this over here so you can see it. I'll save this and you can have this in the download files for this lecture. PolyPaint Demo Painted. That texture will now save with this Z tool. So when you follow along, be careful that you don't open the PolyPaint painted version and then think that you can't PolyPaint, because if I try and PolyPaint now, if I make a huge texture change, like RGB with this blue, and I start painting, I won't see it. That's because the texture is on. It's sitting in front of my painting. So I'm not going to be able to actually see that. So if we, make sure I've got this selected, make sure that I'm on dot stroke, alpha 1. RGB. Oh, the texture is on. There we go. So if I'm painting, I won't see that with the texture turned on. So just be aware of that. So if you do start painting and you don't see anything, it's because you have a texture map turned on in this menu. So once you've cloned the texture to the main texture menu here, click that, and from here you can export it. Now, you can also automate the process of extracting textures using the Z plugin Multimap Exporter tool, which is right here, and we talk about this in another chapter as well. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we close is adjust color. I'll turn off the texture map here, and I need to actually undo that painting that I did. There we go. If I go to the PolyPaint menu, there is an Adjust Colors button here. Now, we talk about Adjust Colors in another video in depth, but if I just click this, frame the mesh, here you can see I've got my character. Now, I can isolate color selections with these swatches. We talk about that in more depth in the video that's dedicated to this tool. But I just want to show you that if you are looking at your PolyPaint thinking, oh goodness, it's too warm or it's too cool, you can come in here and you can take the red intensity, for example, and you can start to pull that out. And if you look at your preview, you see it starts to go more green and blue. Or let's say you want to warm it up further. You can bring that up above 0 into the positive values, and you can warm him up. Or maybe you think overall, I'm going to click Reset. It's too saturated. You can dial back your saturation with this slider, or you can increase your saturation, or you can change the intensity. We can darken it by lowering the intensity or increase it. So it's really nice to have this so you can make global changes to your PolyPaint that you couldn't do otherwise, because it's not a texture that you export. You'd have to export as a texture, change the texture, and then apply it as PolyPaint. So let's say, for example, we wanted to do something like that. What if we have a texture and we want to apply it as PolyPaint? Well, in that case, watch this. I have Colorize turned on. I will go to White, Color, turn up RGB intensity to 100%, go to Color, Fill Object. So I filled the object. Make sure Texture Map. Let me turn this off. Make sure that I'm on the head. RGB is on. RGB intensity is all the way up. Color. Fill object. There we go. So I've cleared my PolyPaint. However, if I have a texture map, we'll select that texture. It's applied to the surface. I am at my highest subdivision level, 6 million faces. If I go to PolyPaint, I can do PolyPaint from texture. So if I click that, it turns the texture off and it's baked that into the PolyPaint. So now I have PolyPaint again. So then you could further edit this. So that concludes this look at PolyPaint and ZBrush. I hope you found this helpful. It's one of my favorite classes to teach when I'm teaching my Gnomon online classes. So I really enjoy showing people how to use these tools and how to paint creature skins from scratch. We talk more about PolyPaint in the Spotlight painting chapter, where we use Spotlight to project photo reference, so you can see how we can use PolyPaint in other ways in other chapters. So thanks for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.